I never thought I'd be sitting in a courtroom watching my own parents lie about my existence. The mahogany-paneled walls of Judge Harrison's chambers felt like they were closing in on me as I watched the two people who raised me prepare to erase 23 years of my life with a single devastating claim. My name is Emma Catherine Walsh, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I knew exactly who I was. I was the daughter of Robert and Margaret Walsh, born on a rainy Tuesday in October at St. Mary's Hospital in downtown Portland. I had my father's stubborn chin and my mother's green eyes. I was their miracle baby, born after years of trying, the light of their lives, who could do no wrong. But sitting in that leather chair, watching my mother's perfectly manicured hands fidget with her pearl necklace, while my father adjusted his tie for the third time, I realized that everything I thought I knew about myself was about to be systematically dismantled. The morning had started like any other. I'd arrived at my small law practice downtown, coffee in hand, ready to tackle another day of estate planning and minor disputes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent years helping other families navigate inheritance issues, never imagining I'd become the center of one myself. My grandfather, Thomas Walsh, had passed away 6 months earlier. He was a man who'd built his fortune from nothing, starting with a small construction company and growing it into one of Portland's most successful real estate development firms. Grandpa Tom, as I'd always called him, had been my champion, my biggest supporter, and the one person who truly understood my dreams of expanding beyond small-town legal practice. His will had been straightforward, or so I thought. The bulk of his estate, valued at nearly $12 million, was to be divided equally among his children and grandchildren. As his only grandchild, I was set to inherit a substantial portion, enough to pay off my student loans, expand my practice, and maybe even start the nonprofit legal clinic I'd always dreamed of. But dreams, I was learning, could be destroyed with surgical precision. The call had come on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. My Uncle David, my father's brother, had requested a meeting with the family attorney. Something about irregularities in the will. Something about questions regarding my eligibility as a beneficiary. I'd laughed it off initially. What could possibly be irregular about my inheritance? I was Thomas Walsh's granddaughter, born to his son Robert. It was simple, straightforward, indisputable, or so I thought. The meeting had been scheduled for today in Judge Harrison's chambers, with all parties present. My parents had been unusually quiet over the past few weeks, declining my dinner invitations and giving short, clipped answers when I called. I'd attributed it to grief, assuming they were still processing Grandpa's death in their own way. But as I sat there, watching my mother's face grow pale and my father's jaw tighten, I realized their distance had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with guilt. Judge Harrison, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, cleared his throat and looked at the assembled group. Besides my parents and myself, Uncle David was there with his wife Linda, looking uncomfortable but determined. The family attorney, Mr. Stevens, sat at the head of the long conference table, a stack of papers before him. "We're here today," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying the weight of decades of difficult decisions, to address concerns raised by David Walsh regarding the inheritance rights of Emma Walsh under the terms of Thomas Walsh's will. My heart started beating faster. Inheritance rights. What could possibly be in question about my inheritance rights? Uncle David leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. He was a smaller man than my father, with thinning hair and nervous energy that had always made family gatherings slightly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, I've recently come into possession of information that suggests Emma may not be, that is to say, her biological relationship to the deceased may not be what we've all believed." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. I felt my world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. "What are you talking about?" I managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. My father, who had been staring at his hands, finally looked up. His face was ashen, his eyes avoiding mine. "Emma, sweetheart, this is difficult for all of us. Difficult." I stood up, my chair scraping against the polished floor. "What's difficult? What is Uncle David talking about?" My mother, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the quiet room, every word landed like a physical blow. "Emma, honey, we need to tell you something. We should have told you long ago." The room seemed to spin around me. I gripped the back of my chair, feeling like I needed an anchor to keep from floating away. "Tell me what?" Judge Harrison intervened, his voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps we should allow Mr. and Mrs. Walsh to present their statement formally." My father stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to shrink before my eyes. Robert Walsh had always been my hero, the man who taught me to ride a bike, who stayed up late helping me with calculus homework, who walked me down the aisle at my wedding to James 3 years ago. He was solid, dependable, the kind of man who kept his word and protected his family. But the man standing before me now looked like a stranger. "Your Honor," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "My wife and I we need to clarify Emma's parentage for the record." My knees gave out, and I sank back into my chair. Parentage. The word echoed in my mind like a death knell. My mother stood up beside him, her usually perfect composure cracking. Margaret Walsh was a woman who prided herself on control, on maintaining appearances, on being the picture-perfect wife and mother. She coordinated charity events, hosted dinner parties, and never had a hair out of place. But looking at her now, I saw cracks in her facade that I'd never noticed before. "Emma," she said, her voice breaking, "we love you. We've always loved you like our own daughter. But the truth is," she couldn't finish the sentence. The words seemed to stick in her throat like glass. My father reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "The truth is, Emma, you're adopted. We adopted you when you were 3 days old from a young woman who couldn't care for you. We were so grateful, so happy to have you in our lives, that we decided to raise you, as if you were our biological daughter." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I stared at my parents, trying to process what I'd just heard, trying to make sense of words that felt like they were being spoken in a foreign language. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I have your eyes, Mom. People always said I had your eyes." My mother's face crumpled. "Green eyes aren't that uncommon, sweetheart. We wanted so badly for you to feel like you belonged, to feel like you were truly ours, that we encouraged those comparisons. We let people believe what they wanted to believe." "But my birth certificate," I said, my voice getting stronger, more desperate. "My birth certificate says you're my parents. It says I was born at St. Mary's Hospital." Mr. Stevens, the family attorney, spoke up for the first time. "Emma, I'm sorry, but the birth certificate was amended. When an adoption is finalized, the state issues a new birth certificate listing the adoptive parents as the legal parents. Your original birth certificate would have listed your biological parents." I felt like I was drowning. The air in the room seemed too thick to breathe, and my vision started to blur around the edges. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane. Why would you keep this from me for 23 years?" "Because we love you," my father said, his voice breaking. "Because from the moment we held you, you were our daughter. Biology didn't matter. You were ours." "But it matters now," Uncle David interjected, his voice cold and calculating. "It matters for the inheritance. Dad's will specifically states that his estate is to be divided among his children and grandchildren. If Emma isn't Robert's biological daughter, then she's not Dad's granddaughter, and she has no claim to the inheritance." The pieces started falling into place, creating a picture so ugly I could barely look at it. "This is about money," I said, my voice getting stronger. "This is about Grandpa's money." "Emma, that's not—" my mother started. "Don't!" I held up my hand, stopping her. "Don't you dare tell me this isn't about money. You kept this secret for 23 years, and now, conveniently, right when I'm about to inherit millions of dollars, you decide to tell the truth?" My father's face flushed red. "It's not like that, Emma. David has been asking questions, doing research. He found some old records, and we couldn't keep lying anymore." "Old records?" I turned to Uncle David, feeling a rage building inside me that I didn't recognize. "What kind of old records?" Uncle David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I hired a private investigator to look into the family history for genealogy purposes. He found some discrepancies in the timeline of your birth and adoption. He also found the original adoption papers. You hired a private investigator to research your own family?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You went behind everyone's back to dig up dirt on me?" "It wasn't dirt," Uncle David said defensively. "It was the truth. And the truth is that you're not a Walsh by blood. You have no legal claim to Dad's estate." Judge Harrison, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Mr. Walsh, I need to remind you that adopted children generally have the same inheritance rights as biological children under Oregon law. The fact that Emma was adopted doesn't automatically disqualify her from inheriting from her grandfather." Relief flooded through me. Of course. Even if I was adopted, I was still legally my father's daughter. I was still Grandpa Tom's granddaughter, in every way that mattered. But Uncle David wasn't finished. "That's true, Your Honor, but only if the adoption was legal and properly documented. And there's reason to believe that, in this case, it wasn't." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" Uncle David pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table to Judge Harrison. "I've found evidence that suggests Emma's adoption was arranged privately, outside of legal channels. There are no official adoption records on file with the state. The birth certificate was falsified." The room started spinning again. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "That's impossible. You can't just falsify birth certificates." "You can if you know the right people," Uncle David said coldly. "And if you're desperate enough." My father stood up abruptly, his chair toppling backward. "That's enough, David. You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Uncle David's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "You and Margaret were trying to have a baby for years. You were desperate. When that young woman approached you with her baby, you saw an opportunity. You arranged a private adoption, paid her off, and then falsified the paperwork to make it look like Emma was your biological daughter." "We didn't falsify anything," my mother said, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. "Then explain this," Uncle David said, pulling out a photograph from his folder. "This is a photo of Margaret at Dad's 60th birthday party. She's supposedly 8 months pregnant with Emma. But look at her closely. Does she look 8 months pregnant to you?" He slid the photograph across the table. I picked it up with shaking hands. It was a picture of my mother at a family gathering, smiling and laughing with relatives. She was wearing a blue dress that hugged her figure. If she was 8 months pregnant, there was no sign of it. "This proves nothing," I said. But even as I spoke, I could hear the doubt in my own voice. "It proves that your mother was never pregnant," Uncle David said triumphantly. "It proves that you were never born to the Walsh family. It proves that this entire charade has been a 23-year lie." I looked at my parents, searching their faces for some sign that Uncle David was wrong, that this was all some horrible mistake. But I saw only guilt and shame and the kind of deep, bone-weary exhaustion that comes from carrying a secret for too long. "Is it true?" I asked quietly. "All of it?" My father sank back into his chair, his shoulders sagging. "Emma, you have to understand. We wanted you so badly. We'd been trying for years and nothing was working. When Sarah came to us— Sarah? I interrupted. Who is Sarah? Your birth mother, my mother said quietly. Sarah Johnson. She was 19, unmarried and scared. She knew she couldn't raise a baby on her own, and she wanted to find a good family for you. A friend of a friend knew about our situation and connected us. So you arranged a private adoption, I said, trying to piece together the story. We arranged to help a young woman who was in trouble, my father said defensively. We gave her money for medical expenses, for rent, for food. We made sure she had prenatal care, and in return, she gave us the most precious gift we could have ever received. But you lied about it, I said. You made fake documents. You pretended I was your biological daughter. We made you our daughter in every way that mattered, my mother said, tears streaming down her face. We raised you. We loved you. We sacrificed for you. Biology is just DNA, Emma. Family is so much more than that. But legally, Uncle David interjected, she's not family. She's not a Walsh. She has no claim to Dad's estate. Judge Harrison, who had been studying the documents Uncle David had provided, looked up. I'm going to need to review these materials more carefully. This is a complex situation that requires careful legal analysis. What does that mean? I asked. It means, the judge said gently, that we need to determine the legal status of your relationship to Thomas Walsh. If your adoption was not properly documented through official channels, then your inheritance rights may indeed be in question. I felt the room spinning again. Not only was I learning that my entire life had been built on a lie, but I was also potentially losing the inheritance that could have changed my life, that could have allowed me to build the legal practice I'd dreamed of, that could have let me help other people navigate the same kind of legal challenges I was facing right now. I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. I need to think. I walked out of the conference room on unsteady legs, my mind reeling with everything I'd just learned. The hallway of the courthouse was quiet, with only the occasional lawyer or court clerk passing by. I found a bench near a window and sat down, staring out at the Portland skyline without really seeing it. 23 years. 23 years of believing I was someone I wasn't. 23 years of family dinners and birthday parties and Christmas mornings, all built on a foundation of lies. How many times had I looked in the mirror and seen my mother's eyes staring back at me? How many times had people commented on my resemblance to my father? How many times had I felt that deep, unshakable sense of belonging that comes from being part of a family? All of it was an illusion. But even as I sat there, drowning in the betrayal and confusion, another emotion started to surface. Anger, not just at my parents for lying to me, but at Uncle David for the calculating way he'd exposed their secret. This wasn't about family truth or justice. This was about money, pure and simple. He'd hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me because he wanted a bigger share of his father's estate. And that's when I remembered something. Something I'd done 2 weeks ago, on a whim, that might change everything. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my email until I found what I was looking for. A confirmation email from GeneTech DNA Services, confirming that my DNA test results were ready. I'd submitted the test kit almost 3 weeks ago, back when I was still blissfully ignorant about my true parentage. It had been one of those impulse purchases, born out of curiosity about my ancestry and genetic health markers. I'd completely forgotten about it until now. With shaking fingers, I logged into the GeneTech website and accessed my results. What I found there made my heart stop. According to the DNA analysis, I was a 99.7% match for Robert Walsh. I was his biological daughter. I read the results 3 times, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing. The science was clear, unambiguous. Despite everything Uncle David had claimed, despite the suspicious photograph and the missing adoption records, I was genetically related to my father. which meant I was also genetically related to my grandfather, which meant I was legally entitled to my inheritance. I stood up from the bench, my legs steadier now, my mind clearer. I had evidence that could destroy Uncle David's entire case. I had proof that would expose his greed and vindicate my parents. I had the truth, but as I walked back toward the conference room, I realized that the truth was more complicated than I'd initially thought. If I was my father's biological daughter, then my parents had been lying about the adoption. But why? What possible reason could they have had for pretending I was adopted when I wasn't? The answer hit me like a physical blow. My mother had been pregnant. She had given birth to me. But for some reason they'd covered it up, created an elaborate fiction about adoption and false documents. Why would they do that unless there was something about my birth that they were ashamed of? I stopped walking, my hand on the door handle of the conference room. What if my mother had been pregnant, but not by my father? What if I was the result of an affair, and they'd created the adoption story to cover up the truth? That would explain the photograph Uncle David had shown us, the one where my mother didn't look pregnant. Maybe she'd been hiding her pregnancy from the family, planning to pretend I was adopted to avoid the scandal. But the DNA test proved I was my father's daughter, so that theory didn't work either. I was missing something, some crucial piece of information that would make sense of all the contradictions. But whatever the truth was, I knew one thing for certain. I was Robert Walsh's daughter, and I was Thomas Walsh's granddaughter, and I had a legal right to my inheritance. I opened the door and walked back into the conference room. Everyone looked up as I entered, their faces showing various degrees of concern and curiosity. "I'm sorry," I said, taking my seat. "I needed a moment to process everything." Judge Harrison nodded sympathetically. "This is obviously a very difficult situation for everyone involved. I've been reviewing the materials Mr. David Walsh provided, and I must say, they raise some serious questions about the documentation surrounding Emma's birth and adoption. Questions that I can answer," I said, reaching into my purse. Uncle David leaned forward eagerly. "Oh, I doubt that, Emma. The evidence is pretty clear." "Is it?" I interrupted, pulling out a folded piece of paper, "because I have evidence of my own." I handed the paper to Judge Harrison. It was a printout of my DNA test results, showing the clear genetic match between myself and my father. The judge studied the document carefully, his eyebrows rising slightly. "This is a DNA test showing that Emma Walsh is the biological daughter of Robert Walsh." The room fell silent. Uncle David's face went pale. "That's impossible. The adoption records are apparently false," Judge Harrison said, looking at my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Walsh, can you explain this discrepancy?" My parents looked at each other, having a silent conversation that I couldn't interpret. Finally, my father spoke. "Your Honor, I think we need to tell you the whole truth." "I think that would be advisable," the judge said dryly. My father took a deep breath. "Emma is our biological daughter. She was born at Portland General Hospital on October 15th, not St. Mary's, as her birth certificate states. And the reason we've been lying about it all these years is because—" He stopped, looking at my mother for support. "Because what?" I demanded. My mother closed her eyes, as if she couldn't bear to look at me while she spoke. "Because you were born 3 months premature, Emma. You were so small, so fragile, that the doctors weren't sure you were going to survive. You spent the first 4 months of your life in the neonatal intensive care unit, fighting for every breath." I stared at her, trying to process this new information. "But why would you lie about that? Why would you make up a story about adoption?" "Because your father's family has a history of premature births," my mother said quietly. "His sister died at birth because she was born too early. Your grandmother had 3 miscarriages before she had your father, and David, when you were born so prematurely your grandfather was, He was devastated. He blamed himself, thought it was his fault, that he'd passed on some kind of genetic defect. So you lied to protect him? I asked. We lied to protect everyone, my father said. Grandpa Tom was so traumatized by your difficult birth that he started talking about not wanting you to be part of the family inheritance. He was afraid that if you had children, they might have the same problems. He was talking about changing his will. The pieces started falling into place. So you made up the adoption story to make him think I wasn't genetically related to the family. We made up the adoption story to give you a chance at a normal life, my mother said. We wanted you to be loved and accepted by your grandfather, without the shadow of his fears and guilt hanging over you. But that doesn't make sense, Uncle David interjected. If you told him she was adopted, why would he include her in his will at all? Because he fell in love with her, my father said simply. Despite everything, despite his fears about genetics and family history, he couldn't help but love Emma. By the time she was 5 years old, he was completely devoted to her. He used to say that maybe adoption was better than biology, because it meant he'd chosen her, rather than just inheriting her. I felt tears building in my eyes. Grandpa Tom had always been special to me, but knowing that he'd chosen to love me despite his fears made his affection even more precious. But you never told him the truth, I said. You let him die believing I was adopted. We were going to tell him, my mother said. We talked about it many times over the years. But he was so happy with the story we'd created, so proud of the way he'd accepted you into the family, despite your not being blood related, that we didn't want to take that away from him. And besides, my father added, we were afraid that if we told him the truth, he might remember his original fears about genetics and change his will again. Judge Harrison, who had been listening to this family drama unfold, cleared his throat. So, to summarize, Emma Walsh is the biological daughter of Robert Walsh, and therefore the biological granddaughter of Thomas Walsh. She was born prematurely, which caused her grandfather to have concerns about genetic inheritance, which led her parents to create a false adoption story to protect both Emma and her grandfather from those concerns. That's correct, my father said. And David Walsh hired a private investigator to uncover what he believed to be adoption fraud, not knowing that the adoption story was false, but that Emma was actually the biological granddaughter he was trying to disinherit. Uncle David's face was red with embarrassment and anger. I was trying to protect my father's legacy. I thought she was taking advantage of his kindness. You were trying to steal my inheritance, I said flatly. You were trying to use my parents' lie against me to get more money for yourself. That's not true, Uncle David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Judge Harrison studied the DNA test results again. Based on this evidence, I see no legal reason why Emma Walsh would not be entitled to inherit from her grandfather's estate, according to the terms of his will. She is demonstrably his biological granddaughter. Relief flooded through me. I was going to inherit Grandpa Tom's estate. I was going to be able to expand my practice, pay off my student loans, and start the non-profit legal clinic I'd dreamed of. But even as I felt the satisfaction of victory, I also felt the weight of everything I'd learned. My parents had lied to me for 23 years. They'd had good reasons born out of love and protection, but they'd still lied, and Uncle David had tried to steal my inheritance based on those lies. I have one more question, I said, looking at my parents. The birth certificate. You said it was falsified. How? My father shifted uncomfortably. We had a friend who worked at the Vital Records office. She helped us create a new birth certificate that listed St. Mary's as your birthplace instead of Portland General. We thought it would be easier to maintain the adoption story if there weren't any medical records at the hospital where you were supposedly born. So you did falsify official documents, I said. We did what we thought was best for our family, my mother said defensively. Judge Harrison looked stern. Falsifying government documents is a serious crime, Mr. and Mrs. Walsh. However, given the circumstances and the amount of time that has passed, I'm not inclined to pursue charges unless the district attorney feels differently. What about the adoption papers Uncle David found? I asked. Those were fake too, my father admitted. We created them to support the adoption story, in case anyone ever asked questions. So you've been running an elaborate con for over 20 years, I said. We've been protecting our daughter, my mother said firmly. And we'd do it again. I looked around the room at my family, this group of people who had shaped my entire life through their lies, and love and fear and greed. My parents, who had loved me enough to risk criminal charges to protect me from my grandfather's genetic fears. My uncle, who had loved money more than family loyalty. My grandfather, who had been so traumatized by my difficult birth that he'd been willing to write me out of his will, but who had ultimately chosen love over fear. I need to think about all of this, I said finally. I need to figure out what it all means. What it means, Judge Harrison said, is that you are legally entitled to your inheritance. Your biological relationship to Thomas Walsh is established, and that's what matters under the law. I nodded, but I knew that legal entitlement was only part of the story. There were still so many questions, so many emotional wounds that needed to be addressed. There's something else, I said, looking directly at Uncle David. I want to know exactly what you found in your investigation. I want to know what other lies you've uncovered. Uncle David looked uncomfortable. I think I've said enough for one day. No, I said firmly. You started this. You opened this can of worms. Now I want to know everything. Judge Harrison nodded. I think that's reasonable. Mr. Walsh, what other information did your investigation uncover? Uncle David reluctantly opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. The investigator found records of large cash payments made by Robert and Margaret to a Sarah Johnson over a period of several months. He also found evidence that Sarah Johnson never existed. The name was an alias used by someone else. An alias for who? I asked. For Margaret, Uncle David said quietly. The investigator believes that Margaret used the name Sarah Johnson to create a false identity for herself, to support the adoption story. She opened a bank account in that name, rented an apartment, even got a driver's license. She was creating a paper trail to prove that there was a birth mother who had given you up for adoption. I stared at my mother, hardly believing what I was hearing. You created an entire fake identity? My mother's face was streaked with tears. We were young, Emma. We were scared. When you were born so prematurely, when your grandfather started talking about changing his will, we panicked. We thought if we could create a believable adoption story, we could protect you from his fears and ensure that you'd be treated as a full member of the family. But you didn't stop there, Uncle David continued. You also created fake medical records for the supposed birth mother, fake references from a supposed adoption agency, even fake letters from Sarah Johnson explaining why she was giving up her baby. My God, I whispered. How far did this go? All the way, my father said quietly. We created an entire alternate reality to protect you, Emma. We thought we were doing the right thing. The right thing would have been to tell Grandpa Tom the truth, I said. The right thing would have been to trust him to love me, regardless of my genetics. We were afraid, my mother said. We were afraid that if he knew the truth, he'd never be able to look at you without thinking about all the genetic problems in the family. We were afraid that his love for you would be tainted by fear. So instead you built our entire relationship on a lie, I said. We built it on love, my father said. Everything we did was motivated by love. I stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the energy that was building inside me. Love doesn't excuse lying, Dad. Love doesn't excuse fraud. Love doesn't excuse creating fake identities and falsifying documents and lying to your daughter for 23 years. Emma, my mother said, reaching out to me. Don't, I said, stepping back. Don't touch me. I need time to process this. I need time to figure out who I am if everything I've believed about myself is a lie. Judge Harrison, who had been listening to this family drama with professional detachment, finally spoke. I think we've covered the legal issues for today. Emma Walsh is the biological daughter of Robert Walsh, and therefore entitled to inherit from Thomas Walsh's estate, according to the terms of his will. The question of whether charges should be filed for document falsification is a matter for the district attorney's office. What about Uncle David? I asked. What about his attempt to steal my inheritance? I wasn't trying to steal anything, Uncle David protested. I was trying to ensure that Dad's will was followed properly. You were trying to ensure that you got a bigger share of the estate, I said. You hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me because you thought it would mean more money for you. That's not true, Uncle David said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I pulled out my phone and showed him the screen. I recorded our conversation 3 weeks ago when you first started asking questions about my adoption. Do you remember what you said? Uncle David went pale. You recorded me? I'm a lawyer, Uncle David. I record conversations when I think they might be legally relevant. And in this recording, you very clearly state that you think I'm taking advantage of Dad's generosity and that you want to make sure the real family gets what's rightfully theirs. I played a snippet of the recording. Uncle David's voice came through clearly. I just think it's important that we make sure Dad's estate goes to people who are actually part of the family, not to some stranger who happened to get lucky with an adoption. The room fell silent. Uncle David's face was red with embarrassment and anger. I think, Judge Harrison said dryly, that this recording makes Mr. David Walsh's motivations quite clear. He was indeed attempting to challenge Emma's inheritance rights for his own financial benefit. I was protecting my father's legacy, Uncle David said weakly. You were protecting your own financial interests, I said, and you were willing to destroy my family to do it. I looked around the room at my parents, my uncle, the judge, and the lawyer. All of these people had played a role in the elaborate deception that had shaped my life. All of them had lied or been lied to, or been complicit in maintaining the lies. I want to know one more thing, I said. I want to know if there are any other secrets, any other lies, anything else that I should know about my life. My parents looked at each other, having another one of their silent conversations. There is one more thing, my father said reluctantly. What now? I asked, not sure I could handle any more revelations. Your difficult birth, he said. It wasn't just that you were premature. There were complications. You had to have surgery when you were just a few days old. The doctors weren't sure you were going to make it. What kind of surgery? Heart surgery, my mother said quietly. You were born with a heart defect. The doctors had to operate to repair it. You have a scar, a very small one, on your chest. I instinctively touched my chest, feeling the small, faint scar that I'd always been told was from a childhood accident. You lied about that too, I said. We didn't want you to grow up thinking of yourself as damaged or fragile, my mother said. We wanted you to feel strong and healthy and normal. But I wasn't normal, I said. I was a premature baby with a heart defect who nearly died. But you didn't die, my father said. You survived. You thrived. You became a brilliant, strong, successful woman. That's what matters. I looked at my parents, these people who had shaped my entire life through their lies and love and fear. They had lied to me about my birth, my adoption, my medical history, my family relationships. They had created fake identities, falsified documents, and maintained an elaborate deception for over 20 years. But they had also loved me. They had protected me. They had given me a happy childhood and a sense of belonging and the confidence to pursue my dreams. "I need time," I said finally. "I need time to think about all of this, to figure out what it means, to decide what I want to do next." "What do you mean?" my mother asked. "I mean, I need to decide whether I can forgive you for lying to me for 23 years, I said. "I need to decide whether I can trust you again. I need to decide what our relationship is going to look like going forward." "Emma," my father said, "we understand that you're angry. We understand that you feel betrayed. But please don't let our mistakes destroy our family." "You destroyed our family when you chose to lie to me," I said. "You destroyed it when you decided that I couldn't handle the truth about my own life." "We were trying to protect you," my mother said desperately. "You were trying to protect yourselves," I said. "You were trying to protect your relationship with Grandpa Tom. You were trying to protect your image as the perfect family. You were trying to protect everything except my right to know the truth about my own life." Judge Harrison cleared his throat. "I think this family has a lot to work through, and that's not something that can be resolved in a legal proceeding. For the purposes of this hearing, I'm ruling that Emma Walsh is the biological granddaughter of Thomas Walsh and is entitled to inherit according to the terms of his will. The estate can proceed with distribution." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said, standing up. "However," the judge continued, "I am going to recommend that the district attorney's office review the evidence of document falsification. While I understand the motivations behind these actions, falsifying government documents is a serious crime." My parents went pale. "Your Honor," my father said, "we're willing to accept whatever consequences there are for our actions." "That's not your decision to make," Judge Harrison said. "That's a decision for the justice system." I looked at my parents, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. They weren't the perfect, loving, protective people I'd always believed them to be. But they weren't monsters either. They were flawed human beings who had made terrible decisions out of love and fear and desperation. "I need to go," I said. "I need to think." I walked out of the courthouse into the bright Portland afternoon, my mind reeling with everything I'd learned. I was still Emma Walsh, but I was also not Emma Walsh. I was still the daughter of Robert and Margaret Walsh, but I was also the product of an elaborate deception that had shaped every aspect of my life. I drove home to the small house I shared with my husband, James, a gentleman who worked as a high school English teacher and who had always been my anchor in stormy weather. He was grading papers at the kitchen table when I walked in, and he looked up with a smile that faded when he saw my face. "Emma, what happened at the meeting?" I sat down across from him and told him everything. About Uncle David's accusations, about my parents' lies, about the DNA test, about the fake adoption, and the falsified documents, and the elaborate deception that had defined my entire life. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more concerned with each revelation. When I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm so sorry, Em. I can't imagine how you must be feeling." "I don't know how I'm feeling," I said honestly. "I'm angry and hurt and confused and relieved and grateful all at the same time. I don't know how to process any of this." "You don't have to process it all at once," he said gently. "You can take as much time as you need to figure out what this means for you." "But what if I never figure it out?" I asked. "What if I never know who I really am?" "You're Emma Walsh," he said simply. "You're my wife. You're a brilliant lawyer. You're a kind and compassionate person who cares about justice and fairness. You're someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. That's who you are, regardless of the circumstances of your birth or the lies your parents told." I felt tears building in my eyes. "But everything I believed about myself was based on lies." "No," James said firmly. "Your character was based on how you chose to respond to the circumstances of your life. Your parents may have lied about your birth, But they didn't lie about loving you. They didn't lie about supporting your dreams. They didn't lie about being proud of who you became. But they lied about everything else, I said. They lied about things that happened before you were old enough to remember, he said. They lied about medical details and legal documents and family history. But they didn't lie about the important things. They didn't lie about loving you, or believing in you, or wanting the best for you. I knew he was right, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. How do I trust them again? How do I have a relationship with people who have been lying to me for 23 years? I don't know, James said honestly. But I know that cutting them out of your life entirely would hurt you more than it would hurt them. They're your parents, Emma. They're flawed, and they made terrible mistakes. But they're still your parents. I spent the next few days in a kind of emotional limbo, trying to process everything I'd learned. I took time off work, something I'd never done before, and spent hours walking around the city, thinking and trying to make sense of my feelings. On the third day, I got a call from my mother. "Emma, sweetheart, I know you need time, but I was hoping we could talk." "I don't know what to say to you, Mom," I said honestly. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "Just let me talk. Let me explain." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked older than I'd ever seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and worry lines creasing her forehead. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. "I'm still angry," I said without preamble. "I'm still hurt. I don't know if I can forgive you." "I know," she said quietly. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. We should have told you the truth years ago." "Why didn't you?" I asked. "Why keep lying for so long?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her tea. "Because we were cowards," she said finally. "Because we were afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see us differently. You'd see how desperate we were, how scared we were, how willing we were to break the law to protect you." "I would have understood," I said. "If you'd told me when I was old enough to understand, I would have been grateful that you protected me from Grandpa Tom's fears." "Would you?" she asked, looking up at me. "Would you really have been grateful to know that your grandfather initially wanted to disinherit you because he was afraid of your genetics? Would you have been grateful to know that you nearly died as a baby, that you had to have heart surgery, that the doctors weren't sure you were going to make it?" I considered her question. "I don't know, but I would have preferred to know the truth than to live a lie." "We thought we were giving you a better life," she said. "We thought we were protecting you from painful truths that would only hurt you." "You were protecting yourselves," I said. "You were protecting your relationship with Grandpa Tom and your image as the perfect family." "Maybe," she admitted. "Maybe we were protecting ourselves too. But Emma, you have to understand, we never stopped loving you. We never stopped being proud of you. We never stopped being grateful that you were our daughter." "But I'm not your daughter," I said. "Not really. I'm the daughter of Sarah Johnson, this fake person you created." "No," my mother said firmly. "You're my daughter. You're the baby I carried for 6 months. The baby I gave birth to. The baby I held in my arms while you fought for your life in the NICU. You're the toddler I taught to walk, the little girl I read bedtime stories to, the teenager I helped with homework. You're the young woman I watched graduate from college and law school, the bride I helped plan a wedding for. You're my daughter in every way that matters." I felt tears building in my eyes despite my anger. "But you lied to me about all of it." "We lied about the circumstances," she said. "We didn't lie about the love." We sat in silence for a while, both of us crying quietly. Finally, I spoke. "I need to know everything," I said. "I need to know every lie, every secret, every piece of the truth you've been hiding from me." "Okay," she said. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know about my birth. I want to know about the heart surgery. I want to know about Grandpa Tom's reaction. I want to know about the fake identity you created. I want to know about every lie you've told me." My mother took a deep breath. "You were born on October 15th at 3:47 in the morning. You were 26 weeks along, which meant you were 14 weeks premature. You weighed 2 pounds, 3 ounces. You were so small that your father's wedding ring could slide up your arm like a bracelet." She paused, wiping tears from her eyes. "The doctors said you had a 50-50 chance of survival. You had underdeveloped lungs, which is common in premature babies, but you also had a heart defect called patent ductus arteriosus, which meant that a blood vessel that should have closed after birth stayed open. It was causing problems with your circulation. So you had to have surgery," I said. "When you were 5 days old," she said. "It was the most terrifying day of my life. You were so small, so fragile, and they were going to cut into your chest. Your father and I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours, not knowing if you were going to survive." "But I did survive," I said. "You did more than survive," she said. "You thrived. The surgery was successful, and your heart healed perfectly. Your lungs developed normally. By the time you were 4 months old, you were meeting all the normal developmental milestones. The doctors said you were a miracle baby." "What about Grandpa Tom?" I asked. My mother's face darkened. "When we told him about your premature birth and the heart surgery, he was devastated. He blamed himself, said it was his fault for passing on defective genes. He started talking about how he didn't want you to suffer the way other family members had suffered. He said he was going to change his will to exclude you from the inheritance so that you wouldn't feel obligated to have children who might have the same problems. So you created the adoption story," I said. "We panicked," she said. "We were young and scared, and we didn't know what to do. We thought if we could convince him that you weren't genetically related to the family, he wouldn't worry about passing on genetic problems. We thought it would be temporary, just until he got to know you and love you for who you were." "But it wasn't temporary," I said. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't. Once we started lying, it became harder and harder to tell the truth. And your grandfather fell in love with you so completely that we were afraid that telling him the truth would somehow change his feelings." "Tell me about Sarah Johnson," I said. My mother looked uncomfortable. "I created the identity when you were about 6 months old. I needed to have a paper trail that would support the adoption story if anyone ever questioned it. I opened a bank account, got a driver's license, rented a small apartment. I created a whole life for this fictional person." "And you kept up the charade for 23 years, I said. "I renewed the driver's license a few times to keep the identity active. I kept the bank account open with a small balance. I thought if anyone ever investigated, they would find evidence that Sarah Johnson was a real person." "What about the adoption papers Uncle David found?" I asked. "I created those too," she said. "I found templates online and filled them out to make it look like there had been a legitimate adoption. I forged signatures, created fake letterhead from a fictional adoption agency. I even wrote letters from Sarah Johnson explaining why she was giving you up." I stared at my mother, trying to reconcile the woman I'd known all my life with the person she was describing. "You committed fraud. You falsified documents. You created a fake identity. You could go to prison for this." "I know," she said simply. "And if that's what happens, I'll accept it. I'll accept whatever consequences there are for my actions." "Was it worth it?" I asked. "Was protecting me from Grandpa Tom's fears worth risking everything?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "You were worth it. You were worth every risk, every lie, every sleepless night. You were worth everything." I felt my anger starting to soften, replaced by a complex mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. "But I didn't need protection. I could have handled the truth." "Maybe," she said. "But we didn't know that at the time. We were young parents dealing with a crisis, and we made the best decisions we could with the information we had. Bad decisions, I said. Yes, she said. Bad decisions, but decisions made out of love. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the weight of everything that had been said. Finally, I spoke. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay, she said. Are there any other lies? Any other secrets? Anything else about my life that isn't what I think it is? She was quiet for a long moment, thinking. There's one more thing, she said reluctantly. What now? I asked, not sure I could handle any more revelations. Your middle name? She said. Catherine. It's not a family name like we told you. It's the name of the nurse who took care of you in the NICU. Catherine Rodriguez. She worked with you every day for 4 months. And she was the one who was holding you when you took your first breath without a ventilator. We named you after her because she helped save your life. I felt tears building in my eyes again. That's actually beautiful, I said. There's more, she said. Catherine Rodriguez still works at Portland General. She's asked about you over the years, wondered how you were doing. She's the one who suggested we not tell you about your difficult birth. Said it would be better for you to grow up thinking of yourself as strong and healthy, rather than fragile and damaged. She's still alive? I asked. She's still alive, my mother confirmed. She's in her 60s now, close to retirement. She's married, has grandchildren of her own, but she's never forgotten you. I want to meet her, I said immediately. I thought you might, my mother said. I have her contact information if you'd like it. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of completion. Catherine Rodriguez, the woman whose name I'd carried for 23 years without knowing why. The woman who had helped save my life when I was too young to remember. Is that everything? I asked. Are there any other secrets? That's everything, my mother said. I've told you every lie, every secret, every piece of the truth we've been hiding from you. I studied her face, looking for any sign of deception, but I saw only exhaustion and regret, and a deep, abiding love that had motivated every terrible decision she'd made. I need time, I said finally. I need time to process all of this, to figure out what it means, to decide what I want our relationship to look like going forward. I understand, she said. Take all the time you need. But, Emma, please don't shut us out completely. We may have made terrible mistakes, but we're still your parents. We still love you more than anything in the world. I know, I said quietly. I know you love me, but love isn't enough to fix this. Trust has to be rebuilt, and that takes time. We'll wait, she said. We'll wait as long as it takes. I left the coffee shop feeling emotionally drained, but also somehow clearer. I drove home to James, who was cooking dinner, and who looked up with hopeful eyes when I walked in. How did it go? He asked. It was hard, I said, but I think it was necessary. I think I understand now why they did what they did, even if I don't agree with it. Are you going to forgive them? He asked. I don't know, I said honestly. I want to. I love them, despite everything, but I don't know if I can trust them again. You don't have to decide that tonight, he said gently. You can take as much time as you need. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the emotional turmoil of my family situation. But I also found myself thinking about Catherine Rodriguez, the nurse who had saved my life, and whose name I'd carried unknowingly for 23 years. Finally, I worked up the courage to call her. My mother had given me her number, and I'd been staring at it for days, trying to figure out what to say. Hello? The voice was warm and slightly accented. Is this Catherine Rodriguez? I asked. Yes, this is Catherine. Who is this? My name is Emma Walsh, I said. But when I was born, my name was Emma Catherine Walsh. I think you might remember me. There was a long pause. Emma, the premature baby from 23 years ago. The one with the heart defect. That's me, I said, feeling tears building in my eyes. "Oh my God," she said, and I could hear the emotion in her voice. "Emma, I've wondered about you for so many years. How are you? Are you healthy? Are you happy?" "I'm both," I said. "I'm a lawyer now. I'm married to a wonderful man. I'm healthy and happy and successful, and I owe a lot of that to you." "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I was just doing my job." "You were doing more than your job," I said. "You were saving my life, and I just learned that you're the reason I have the middle name Catherine." "Your parents told you about that?" she asked, sounding surprised. "They told me about a lot of things," I said. "It's a long story. I was wondering if you'd like to meet for coffee sometime. I'd love to hear about those first few months of my life, and I'd love to thank you in person." "I would love that," she said warmly. "I would absolutely love that." We arranged to meet the following Saturday at a cafe near the hospital, where she still worked. I arrived early, nervous and excited, and not sure what to expect. Catherine arrived a few minutes later, a small, elegant woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. "Emma?" she said, approaching my table tentatively. "Catherine," I said, standing up. "Thank you for coming." She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears. "You're beautiful," she said finally. "You're so beautiful, and healthy and strong. I can't believe you're the same tiny baby I used to hold in my hands." We sat down, and she told me stories about those first few months of my life. She told me about how small I was, how fragile, how she used to sing to me during the long nights when I couldn't sleep. She told me about the day I had heart surgery, how scared my parents were, how relieved everyone was when the surgery was successful. "Your parents were so young," she said. "They were terrified and exhausted and overwhelmed, but they never left your side. They took turns sleeping in the chair next to your incubator, and they talked to you constantly, even when you couldn't respond." "They lied to me about all of this," I said. "They made up a story about adoption to protect me from some family genetics fears." Catherine nodded. "I know. They asked me about it at the time, whether they should tell you about your difficult birth. I advised them not to, and I've regretted that advice ever since." Why did you advise them not to tell me?" I asked. "Because I was thinking like a medical professional, not like a parent," she said. "I was thinking about the potential psychological impact of knowing you'd nearly died as a baby, of knowing you'd had major surgery, of knowing you'd been considered fragile and at risk. I thought it would be better for you to grow up feeling strong and healthy and normal." "But that wasn't your decision to make," I said. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't. And I'm sorry for that. Parents should make decisions about their children, not medical professionals. I overstepped my bounds." "You were trying to help," I said. "I was trying to help, but I was wrong," she said. "Children deserve to know the truth about their own lives, even if that truth is sometimes difficult or painful." We talked for 2 hours, and by the time we said goodbye, I felt like I'd recovered a missing piece of myself. Catherine Rodriguez wasn't just the nurse who had saved my life. She was a link to my true history, a person who had known me before I was old enough to know myself. "I want to stay in touch," I said as we prepared to leave. "I would like that very much," she said. "And Emma, I want you to know that you were never just a patient to me. You were a fighter, a survivor, a little girl who refused to give up. That's who you've always been, and that's who you still are." Driving home, I felt something shift inside me. I was still angry at my parents for lying to me, still hurt by their deception, still confused about my identity. But I was also beginning to understand that my identity wasn't defined by the circumstances of my birth or the lies my parents had told. It was defined by the choices I'd made, the person I'd become, the life I'd built. I was Emma Catherine Walsh, named for a nurse who had saved my life. I was the daughter of Robert and Margaret Walsh, who had loved me enough to risk everything to protect me. I was the granddaughter of Thomas Walsh, who had chosen to love me despite his fears. I was the wife of James Walsh, who had stood by me through this crisis. I was a lawyer who fought for justice and fairness and truth. And I was a fighter, a survivor, someone who refused to give up. The next week I called my parents and asked them to meet me at our house. They arrived looking nervous and hopeful, and I could see the toll the past few weeks had taken on them. "I've been thinking about everything," I said once we were all sitting in the living room. "About the lies, about the secrets, about what it all means. And," my father asked quietly, "and I've decided that I want to rebuild our relationship," I said. "I want to find a way to trust you again. But things have to be different." "Different how?" my mother asked. "No more lies," I said firmly. "No more secrets. No more protecting me from painful truth. If something happens in our family, I want to know about it. If there are problems or challenges or difficulties, I want to be included in the discussions. I want to be treated like an adult who can handle the truth." "We can do that," my father said immediately. "I'm not finished," I said. "I also want you to get help. I want you to talk to a therapist about why you felt the need to lie to me for 23 years. I want you to work on understanding your own motivations and fears so that this never happens again." "We'll do whatever you want," my mother said. "We'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust back. And I want you to make things right with the legal system," I said. "I want you to contact the district attorney's office and explain what you did. I want you to accept responsibility for the crimes you committed. I want you to face the consequences of your actions." My parents looked at each other, and I could see the fear in their eyes. "Emma," my father said, "we could go to prison." "I know," I said, "and I'm sorry about that. But you committed crimes, and you need to face the consequences. I can't have a relationship with you if you're living as fugitives from justice." "We'll do it," my mother said quietly. "We'll contact the district attorney tomorrow." "Good," I said. "And one more thing. I want you to help me contact Sarah Johnson." "But Emma," my father said, "Sarah Johnson doesn't exist. She was a fictional identity I created." "I know," I said. "But there are records, bank accounts, a whole false identity that you created. I want to help you properly dissolve that identity. I want to make sure there are no loose ends, no potential for future legal problems." "We can do that," my mother said. "We can take care of all of that." "Then we can start over," I said. "We can start building a new relationship based on honesty and truth and respect." My parents both started crying, and I found myself crying too. We sat there for a long time, holding each other and grieving for the family we'd lost, while also celebrating the family we might be able to build. "I love you," my mother said through her tears. "I love you too," I said. "I've never stopped loving you. But love isn't enough. We need trust, and we need honesty, and we need respect. We need to do better." "We will," my father said. "We'll do better. We promise." "Don't promise me," I said. "Show me. Show me through your actions that you're committed to change." Over the following months, my parents kept their word. They contacted the district attorney's office and explained their actions. They were charged with document fraud and identity theft, but because of their cooperation and the unusual circumstances of their crimes, they were sentenced to probation and community service rather than prison time. They also started seeing a therapist, both individually and together, to work through their issues with control and fear and their tendency to lie to protect the people they loved. It wasn't easy work, and there were setbacks and difficult conversations, but they committed to it. I started seeing my own therapist to work through my feelings about the betrayal and my confusion about my identity. It helped to talk to someone objective about the complex emotions I was experiencing, and slowly, I began to feel more grounded and secure in who I was. James was incredibly supportive throughout the entire process, never pushing me to forgive my parents, but also never encouraging me to cut them out of my life. He listened when I needed to talk, held me when I needed to cry, and gave me space when I needed to think. "You're handling this incredibly well," he said one evening as we sat on our back porch, watching the sunset. "I don't feel like I'm handling it well," I said. "I feel like I'm stumbling through it." "But you're not giving up," he said. "You're not running away from the difficult emotions or the complicated relationships. You're facing everything head on and trying to find a way forward. That takes incredible strength." "I learned that from Catherine Rodriguez," I said. "She told me I was a fighter, a survivor, someone who refused to give up. I want to live up to that." "You already do," he said, taking my hand. "You already do." The inheritance from my grandfather was finally settled 6 months after that first terrible meeting in Judge Harrison's chambers. The money allowed me to pay off my student loans, expand my law practice, and start the non-profit legal clinic I'd always dreamed of. I decided to name it the Thomas Walsh Legal Clinic, in honor of the grandfather who had loved me enough to include me in his will, despite his fears about genetics. But I also decided to add a subtitle, "In memory of Thomas Walsh and in honor of Catherine Rodriguez," acknowledging both the grandfather, who had left me the means to help others, and the nurse who had saved my life and whose name I carried. The clinic specialized in family law, helping people navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges of adoption, inheritance, and family disputes. It felt like a way to turn my own painful experience into something positive, something that could help other families avoid the mistakes mine had made. Uncle David and I never fully reconciled. He apologized for his role in exposing our family's secrets, but I could never quite forgive him for the calculating way he'd tried to steal my inheritance. We remained civil at family gatherings, but we never developed the close relationship I'd had with him before. My relationship with my parents slowly improved. It took months of therapy and difficult conversations and small steps toward rebuilding trust, but eventually, we found our way back to each other. Not to the relationship we'd had before, which had been built on lies and false assumptions, but to a new relationship based on honesty and respect and hard-won trust. The lies they'd told me had shaped my entire life, but they didn't define me. I was more than the sum of my parents' mistakes, more than the circumstances of my birth, more than the secrets that had been kept from me. I was a person who had chosen to face the truth, to demand honesty, to fight for justice, and to build something positive from the wreckage of deception. I was Emma Catherine Walsh, fighter and survivor, and I refused to give up. 1 year after that first meeting in Judge Harrison's chambers, I was sitting in my office at the Thomas Walsh Legal Clinic when my secretary buzzed me. "Emma, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about a family matter." "Send her in," I said, expecting another client with an adoption dispute or inheritance issue. But the woman who walked into my office was someone I'd never seen before. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair and nervous eyes. She clutched a manila envelope in her hands. "Ms. Walsh?" she said tentatively. "My name is Jennifer Johnson. I think we might be related." I felt my heart skip a beat. "Related how?" "I think," she said, sitting down in the chair across from my desk. "I think I might be your sister." The world tilted again, just like it had a year ago in Judge Harrison's chambers. "I don't have a sister," I said automatically. "I know," she said. "That's what I thought too. But I've been doing some research into my family history, and I found some irregularities. I found records of a woman named Sarah Johnson, who might have been my mother, but I can't find any other trace of her existence." I stared at her, my mind racing. Sarah Johnson was a fictional identity created by my mother. "I know," she said quietly. "I've been investigating for months, and I think I've figured out what happened. I think when your parents created the false identity of Sarah Johnson, They accidentally used the name of a real person, my mother, and I think there might be some kind of connection between our families that we don't know about." She opened the manila envelope and pulled out several documents. "These are birth certificates, adoption records, and DNA test results. I think they might explain everything." I took the documents with shaking hands, feeling like I was about to discover yet another layer of lies and secrets that had shaped my life. But as I read through the papers, I realized that this time, I was ready for the truth, whatever it might be, because I was Emma Catherine Walsh, fighter and survivor, and I refused to give up. And this time I was determined to face whatever came next with courage, honesty, and the unshakable knowledge that I was more than the sum of my circumstances. I was someone who had survived, who had fought back, who had rebuilt her life from the wreckage of deception. I was someone who had learned that family isn't just about blood or genetics or legal documents. It's about the people who choose to love you, who choose to stand by you, who choose to fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. And most importantly, I was someone who had learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than the most beautiful lie. The story of my inheritance had ended, but the story of my life was just beginning.